Okay, I think we're live. Hello, everyone. Well, look, thank you very much for joining today's session. My name is David. I'm the head of consulting at the Happiness Index. The Happiness Index, if you know us, we're very famous for our global benchmark of how employees think and feel at work. If you'd like to benchmark your organization and take part in our global workplace happiness study, go to our website, thehappinessindex.com. You'll find plenty of links on the website so that you can take part as well. The business itself, we've been going for a bit over 10 years. Most of our customers work with us to use our employee engagement platform so that they can measure and understand how their employees think and feel at work. And the newest part of the business is our performance consultancy. That's the part that I lead. So my role focuses on helping organizations to link their people data to their business performance, essentially proving the ROI of culture. And that's exactly what we're going to explore today. So here's what we're going to cover. We're going to start with setting the scene of the challenge facing organizations. We'll then explore some of the evidence from academia. We won't spend too long on that, but I think it's useful to look at some of the research and data that links culture and performance in organizations. We'll then look at what it is that specifically you should be doing, what you should be measuring, and identifying which aspects of culture make the biggest difference in your organization. We'll talk about what great performance data looks like, how to bring it all together in a way that's clear, credible, and commercially relevant to you, how you might go about testing your data, and hopefully at the end we'll have some time for some questions. So as we go along the slides, I can see loads of you are introducing yourself and where you're from, so thank you very much for that. If you do think of anything as we go, just pop them into the chat, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end to run through some of those. Before we dive into the data, just want to get a quick sense of the room. So you should hopefully see a poll appear on your screen. And the question is, would you describe yourself as commercially minded in your role? There's no right or wrong answer, just select yes or no, very binary options here, just to get a sense and a feel for how people see themselves when it comes to linking culture with commercial outcomes. Give you a chance to respond. All right. I think most people have managed to respond by now, so thank you for chiming in and sharing your thoughts. Joe, if you could share, I don't know if it's possible to share those results or if everyone can see them already. Brilliant. So we've got about three quarters of the people saying yes, they're commercially minded in their role. About a quarter saying no, they're not. So maybe roughly where I might have expected it to be. If we can hide those results now, and I move on to the next slide. Well, what's kind of interesting is that, I don't know if you recall, but when you registered for the webinar, we also asked a question about, are you currently able to prove the ROI of your culture? And in that question, less than 10% of people said yes, they could. So it's a similar but slightly different question. But what it does tell us then, if only less than 10% of people are currently able to do it, but three quarters of the people on this call have said that yes, they are commercially minded in their role. Most people, when they registered, have a sort of HR professional type background. Well, it's telling us that most HR people, they are commercially minded. They want to be commercially minded in their role. The intent, the mindset is there. So the gap that we're seeing between the two sets of results, then it's not about intent, it's not about belief, but it's about the systems and the framework and access to the right data in order to do so. And that's what we're going to be unpacking today. I've just seen a question that's come through from Nia. So that's a really good question. So challenging question: if you work in public or non-profit sector, commercial looks different. You're absolutely right. And apologies, as we go through these slides, I'll probably just slip into talking about commercial and financial data just out of habit, because that's my background. But all of this can be applicable to non-profit organizations as well. And we'll touch on that in a little bit later on. Just going back to these slides then. So if we saw that over 90% of people on this webinar, when they registered, said that they can't currently prove the return of their investment in their culture, well, this is often what we see in practice. So an HR leader, they'll be working with us, they'll get their survey results from their latest employee survey, they'll take them to the board meeting, and they'll say something like, "Great news, everyone. You know all those changes that we've made in the last year to our people and all the investments we've been making? It's painful, wasn't it? But it's been worthwhile. and it cost us a bit of money, but don't worry, it's all paid off. Our employees, they're a bit happier and a bit more engaged than last year. Now, we might know that that's a good thing. We might understand that happier, more engaged employees, a happier, more engaged workforce is going to be better, particularly in the long term for an organization. But that message doesn't always land well with the CFO. Because the CEO and CFO, from their perspective, they're thinking, so what? We've got shareholders to answer to. We've got the AGM coming up, and they're going to be asking us about why we've missed our growth target for the last 2 quarters. And that's really the heart of the problem. It's not that they don't care about people. It's that they don't really see the clear line between the people data, the investments in the culture, and the business performance data. And that's the bridge that we need to build. So to simplify things then, what we're really trying to do, we're trying to understand if culture can be shown to deliver a return on investment. Culture itself is really difficult to measure. It's complex. It looks different in every organization. But what we can measure is its impact. We can measure how it shapes the employee experience and how that in turn drives the results further downstream. Now, the questions that we need to answer then are, number one, does culture affect how employees think and feel? And then subsequently, does how employees think and feel affect commercial outcomes? So if we start with the first question, does an organization's culture impact how employees think and feel? Of course it does. Everyone here instinctively knows that to be true. We've probably had examples where we've worked in places with maybe a negative, maybe a toxic culture, and that's impacted our own performance, or we've seen it impact other people. It might be the opposite. We might have worked in places with brilliant cultures where we feel happy and engaged and empowered and motivated, and you can see that that drives the performance of yourself and your teammates. The research backs it up as well. There's a wealth of academic research out there that links organization culture to employee well-being, engagement, trust, motivation, all of which directly influence how people think and feel about their work. I've put some examples up on the screen if you'd like to dig into the detail. When we share the slides later on, I think there should be a link on the screen as well. You'll be able to download a PDF of them. You'll be able to access those studies. Well worth a read. So based on, I suppose, a bit of common sense and also backed up by academic evidence, we can put a big tick on that first question. Culture absolutely impacts how employees think and feel at work. Of course it does. Let's move on to the next link in the chain. Does how employees think and feel at work affect commercial outcomes? Again, the answer is yes. You can probably picture this from your own experience. So if you think about the last time that you went to a restaurant and you had a brilliant waiter, before you know it, you've only intended to go in there because you wanted a pizza, but the waiter's convinced you to have the more expensive bottle of wine. You've maybe ordered some bread and olives for the table. You've ordered a pudding, even though you're on a diet and you're full after 3 courses anyway. It's 11 o'clock at night and you've still ordered a coffee for some unknown reason. It's an anecdotal example, but most of us can probably relate to it, that member of the waiting staff has directly influenced your experience in that location and your propensity to pay for their services. There is also academic research that supports this link too, and we'll come on to that in just a sec. We will get to very specific examples of how you can go about proving this in your own organization, but the next couple of slides look at a couple of academic studies on this topic. The first is a piece of research called Happiness and Productivity from the University of Warwick. It was a controlled experiment. It involved 700 participants, and each participant was asked to complete a set of quite simple maths questions. So they were asked to add together 5 two-digit numbers at a time and see how many they could answer correctly in 10 minutes. Each of the participants was paid for each correct answer. They were all paid the same, so it was a fair test, but there was also an incentive for them to do well. The researchers controlled for general maths ability, so they weren't scored on this, but people were asked to complete a more rigorous GMAT style set of maths questions, so they could tell whether someone was just getting lots of questions right because they were good at maths, or whether there was something else influencing them as part of the experiment. The participants also completed a short survey about how happy they were. They ranked themselves on a 7-point scale. And this is where it gets really interesting, right? The researchers split the groups up and tried to influence some of the groups' levels of happiness. So some of the groups were shown a short comedy video. Other groups were given something nice to eat, so a bit of fruit or a bit of chocolate, and others just weren't given anything at all. And the results are pretty striking. So when people were surveyed before the test and they said that they were happier, they answered that they were quite happy. On average, they answered between 10 and 20% more questions correctly in the same time compared to people who said that they were unhappy. And it could be influenced. Because they started surveying people at different points throughout the test, they could influence how happy they were. So when people were given the treatment of watching a video or having the bit of chocolate or the bit of fruit, their scores improved. And in the same vein, when their scores improved, the ones whose scores improved the most, also their maths ability increased the most as well. So the data showed that they tried more problems and they made fewer careless mistakes as they were going along. So what the researchers concluded from this was that happier people, they put in a bit more effort, they were more motivated, they were less distracted, and they were more cognitively flexible when it came to problem solving. So in short, happiness didn't just make people feel good, it made them perform better. So obviously this study wasn't conducted in the workplace, but it does demonstrate a key principle. It demonstrates that how we feel directly affects how we perform. So the second study takes us out of the lab, and into the real workplace, specifically the call centres of BT, British Telecom. So this research was carried out by researchers at Oxford, MIT, and Rotterdam. The image of the guy in the sort of top centre, when I send the slides around, or maybe if you can download them, there's a link on the slide to a brilliant podcast that we've got with one of the researchers. That's him, Jan Emmanuel Deneve. He talks about this study as well. It's a brilliant podcast, well worth a listen. I'll give you the summary. So the study involved 1,700 employees across BT call centres all over the UK over a 6-month period. The people working in the call centres, they had zero control over the calls that they received. They just were working their hours, and calls came in from anywhere in the country as and when these call centre workers were available. They were just allocated at random. So it makes it a really clean experiment because it removes bias around the types of customers that they were dealing with. Once a week, each employee was asked a one-question survey. Overall, how happy did you feel this week? And their responses were then linked directly to BT's own performance data, the stuff that BT really cared about, things like how many calls did this person take, how many of those calls resulted in a sale, and what was the value of those sales. The results were pretty striking. So a 1-point increase on that 5-point scale of happiness led to a 13% rise in the sales that person made that week. And the uplift wasn't because they were working longer hours or handling more calls. It was because they were simply more effective in the conversations they were having. Now, not all calls are equal. The difference was particularly evident in more complex calls. So the simple ones are a potential customer, they've seen an advert for British Telecom, they pick up the phone and say, hello, I'd like to buy your broadband, here's my credit card details. Happiness for the employees made literally zero difference in those calls. The impact came in the complex calls. So it's a customer phones up and they're annoyed. They're annoyed because their monthly bill's gone up at the end of their contract. But by the end of that call, the call handlers been able to turn it around for them. They've not just convinced them to stay with BT, they've upgraded their broadband, they've added a TV package, maybe they've got a mobile phone deal as well. That's where happiness really, really made a difference. The really clever thing about this study is that the researchers controlled for the weather that the call center workers were experiencing. Don't forget, they were located all around the country. So in the UK, as most of us will know, the weather will vary very, very much from day to day, depending on where you are in the country. But this meant that they could tell whether happiness was causing better sales or whether someone just being good at sales in a week was making them happier. And the results showed it was the former. So when the weather improved, the employees' happiness rose, and subsequently, so did their sales performance afterwards. So this study proves it's some of the clearest workplace evidence that happier employees, they don't just feel better, they actually perform better, particularly when the job requires emotional resilience, focus, and persuasion. So enough about academic studies. I'm going to make it a bit more relevant, a bit closer to home for you. So the goal for what we're trying to do is to help you translate insights about your people and your culture into hard performance metrics specific to your organization that prove the value of what you're doing. So if that's what we want to achieve, then the obvious question is, right, well, where do you start? And the starting point's all about getting the right data in the first place. The right data, it's really going to depend on the type of organization that you are and what's relevant to you. There isn't a one-size-fits-all formula. I've popped some examples up on the screen. These are examples of the sorts of organizations that we're working with and the sorts of analysis that we're helping them to achieve. So a restaurant group, they want to understand how its waiting staff affect average spend per customer. A charity wants to link employee sentiment to outcomes, the quality of life outcomes for the people in their care. A software company is exploring how culture influences new revenue versus target for each person in their sales team. And a bank is studying the connection between employee sentiment, customer feedback, net promoter score from their customer support teams. And they've chosen that metric because they know that it's a predictor of customer retention and future cross-sell opportunities for things like loans, mortgages, and savings accounts. Something to note from all of these examples is that the metrics don't have to apply to everybody in your business. In fact, it's probably better if they don't. So for these organizations, it might be that they only want to start off by understanding a very specific set of metrics, a very specific set of performance outcomes for the sales team or for the customer service team. That's not going to apply to other departments in their organization. Something else to note is that obviously the data should be relevant to your business and your employees. Yes, it absolutely can and should include feedback data from your employee surveys. And yes, it should also include commercial or performance data that matters to your organization. I'd argue it should also include any other data that's possibly relevant or possibly influencing your employees and your organization's culture from any other source. You're probably already tracking a lot of this stuff or can get a lot of this stuff from your HR system anyway. So things like length of service, their location, training courses they've completed in a given period of time, their salary bands, where did you hire them from? Are they working remotely, hybrid, or are they in the office full time? All of this information, the more information you can pull together, the more chance you're going to be able to identify relationships that up until then you might not have been aware of existing, and you'll be able to use that as part of your analysis. So when it comes to deciding on what performance data you ought to be getting, often HR teams, they're not sure about it, and might often default in a lot of conversations I have, say, oh yeah, no, it'd be really good if we could start understanding absence, or it might be good to understand employee retention. That's possibly important, but it's probably not the sort of metric that's being discussed at shareholder meetings. It's probably not, unless there's a real problem, it's probably not the sort of thing that's being discussed at board level on a regular basis. If you're publicly traded, one of the easiest places to look is in your organization's annual report. So I've just popped up on the screen an example from Unilever. It's their I think, most recent annual report, and it's an extract of their CEO's statement. It's probably too small for you to read, but I've highlighted the words and the themes that appear most often. So yellow for growth, orange for market share, red for efficiency and productivity, pink for sales, purple for profit, and green for people and talent. What you'll notice is that the order, the dominant language, is all about growth and market share, closely followed by efficiency and productivity and sales and profit. Employees and talent, they get a mention, but they get a mention all the way down on page 3. So for this organization, it's not that their people don't matter to them. Of course they do, but what the shareholders and boards really obsess over are the outcomes. It's the commercial outcomes that drive those results. Now, there was a question earlier about linking all of this performance data to non-commercial, so non-profit organizations. If you're working for a non-profit, there's a very good chance you're publishing something like a strategic vision or impact framework. But essentially, it's the same thing. It's how the leaders of that organization define success and how they'll know if they are on track when it comes to achieving it. The other place to look, also very simple, probably something you're doing regularly anyway. Just speak to people in the organization, speak to the leaders in your organization. It doesn't need to be the C-suite. It could just be the people who run a particular team or department. But ask them what success looks like in their world. What is it that they are measured on? What keeps them up at night? What does their job depend on? If they don't achieve something, are they going to get fired? The good news is that they are probably already tracking this data somewhere. It might not be in your HR system or system that contains all of the other information alongside your people data, but it will be there somewhere. It might just be on a spreadsheet. In this example, it's a fictitious example of a software company, but the chief commercial officer, they're probably going to be focusing on things like what's the win rate per pitch per person in their sales team? How much new business did they bring in the last year or last quarter? How does that compare against their revenue target? For business development, very similar, but they're going to be tracking things like sales calls. How many sales calls were made by each business development exec? How many of those turned into meetings? How many meetings did they book? What was the conversion rate from call to meeting? What was the conversion rate from meeting to sale? All of this information likely exists somewhere. Doesn't need to be commercial. It could be, say, for the customer success team, they might be more interested in things like net promoter score for each account manager on average across all of the accounts that they look after. And for customer support, it might be that they are tracking things like how many tickets were closed per person in the customer support team. What was the average time to resolution per person? What were the customer satisfaction scores? How many tickets were reopened because the original answer wasn't satisfactory? Gets a bit more challenging when you get to the chief technology officer. So things like they might be looking at projects delivered on time. They might be looking at code quality. It might be that they're looking at something else that can be quantified, but it does get a bit challenging in that type of role. In those instances, general performance ratings, things, your performance metrics or your performance review process, that might be a better measure for the performance of the people in that team. But the point is that every function is likely to have some data of the performance that matters to them. And your opportunity in HR is to connect your culture and the sentiment data to their measures of success. So we've spoken a bit about then identifying which outcomes matter most to your organization. Well, the next question is, what should your performance data actually look like? Well, first, as we've just been speaking about, it does need to be relevant. It needs to mean something to your senior leaders. If you're a commercial organization, probably to your shareholders too. The next point is it should be tied to individual employees wherever possible. We'll come on to that in the next slide in a bit more detail. We'll give an example, but when you can link a person's sentiment or engagement data and their actual individual performance results, you begin to identify patterns and correlations that if you had clustered them together with other data, say, a particular location, you might have missed. Third, the data should be consistent, because otherwise you're very likely to jump to the wrong conclusions. And then finally, this is a subtle but important one. Ideally, your data should be linked to something that's directly influenced by people's actions in the short term. We call that straight line to impact. So this is the example then of why tying performance to an individual employee matters. And when we start working with organizations, it's pretty common that we'll hear we don't have individual performance data at the moment. That's completely fine. It shouldn't stop you from starting this process. A lot of organizations don't, at least not yet. And as part of our work, we can help you build that capability over time. But it is important because once you start connecting employee sentiment and individual performance, that's when you can start identifying some really, really powerful insights. This is quite a simple example. It's fictitious, but imagine two shops from the same company. Each of these shops has got 10 employees. Both shops have completed their employee surveys and both have exactly the same scores for happiness and engagement across their employees. So on average, they are scoring 6.6 out of 10 for both stores. The average transaction value, believe it or not, is also identical, £83.35. So on the surface, both stores look exactly the same. But it's when you start digging into individual data that the picture changes completely. So in shop one, pretty much everyone is scoring the same. So most people, oh God, I'm going to say it, aren't I? Most people score 6s and 7s. If you've got kids, I can't believe I've said that, sorry. Maybe one person has scored a little bit higher and they've their average transaction value is a little bit higher than everyone else's. But on average, it's pretty much the same across everyone. In shop two, it's more polarized. Some people are scoring 2s and 3s, others are scoring 9s and 10s. So the average looks the same, but the reality at an individual level is very, very different. When we compare that with the sales data, then we start to see the impact of all this. So in shop 2, the people who are scoring 9 or 10 on happiness and engagement achieved an average transaction value of £98. Those scoring below 5 averaged just £63. So that's a massive difference. It's a 56% difference in sales performance between the happiest and least happy employees. That's not a small effect. That's the sort of thing that really moves the needle for the entire business if you can get it right. By going deeper into the data, we can then start asking the right questions. We can start asking, what is it that's driving that difference? It's not just happiness and engagement, but we can start getting more granular. Is it to do with incentives? Is it commute times, manager relationships, shift patterns, training opportunities? It's unlikely to be one thing, but by linking people data to your performance data, you can then start identifying which factors are making the biggest impact. I mentioned that data needs to be consistent. Of course it does. If we all think back to our GCSE science lessons, of course it has to be. Take the restaurant example again. Some staff might only be working Monday and Tuesday mornings. Others might only work Friday and Saturday nights. Their average transaction values for the waiting staff will differ, not because of any effort or attitude or any differences in the culture, but just simply because of customer behavior. It's important that when we're analysing the data, we are comparing like-for-like situations. It's the only way to get a fair picture. I do get asked quite often about, well, what about the stuff we can't control? There will always be things you can't control. It could be bad weather. It could be supply chain issues, unexpected events. It could be the Bank of England change their interest rates. You're right. You can't control them. You're probably right. It is going to have a massive effect that you can't control on some metrics that your business is measuring. Over time, those effects tend to even out. And if you've got multiple employees in the same location or the same situation, they are all going to be affected by those same external factors anyway. So the goal isn't like perfect scientific precision. We're not running a clinical trial. We don't need to get to 99.99% confidence. But what we are looking for is a clear signal in the noise, something that's more solid than gut feel, something that will give you confidence to say, here's the data that shows how our people, how our culture is driving performance. So it's worth acknowledging, I've kind of touched on it already with the example of the chief technology officer. It's worth acknowledging that this approach doesn't apply equally well to every single role in your organization. For some jobs, the link between how someone feels, how they're being impacted by the culture in the organization, and the measurable outcomes that they produce, sometimes it's immediate. You can see it. You can see it in real time. So it could be someone working in sales. It could be someone working at the front of a shop or in a restaurant. It could be a lawyer's hours billed. It could be the customer success score of the person working in a call center. It's that person had a direct and immediate impact on the outcomes for that customer or for that organization. For others, it's much, much harder. And it's spread across so many different variables over such a long period of time that it becomes impossible to measure with any precision. You can't quantify it. So digital marketing, for example, how would you possibly know which campaign or post or ad or level of creativity led to a sale? When I bought a car, I couldn't pinpoint a specific advert that made me choose that particular brand. It was probably a combination of none of them and all of them at the same time. For a scientist working in a biotech firm, might be that they're doing research and development. Well, the culture that enables that scientist to come up with some incredible innovation that might make some breakthrough discovery, that discovery might take 10 or 20 years to materialize. And when it does, it might be worth billions to the company's value, but you'll never be able to tie it back and say, yeah, that's because we had a company meetup 3 times a year and we spent a bit more on our Christmas party or whatever it might be. You're just not able to quantify it in that same way. In those sorts of roles, the best thing you can do is lean on the more traditional performance review process that you've probably already got in place anyway. And it will give you an understanding about how people are perceived to be performing and how that aligns with what they're telling you about their culture and their feedback. It's not perfect, it's subjective, but it will still help you to spot patterns and understand whether your culture is enabling or hindering people's performance. So by this point, You've done the heavy lifting. That's the good news. You've identified the metrics that matter most to your business. You're capturing feedback from employees about how they think and feel, what the culture's like for them. You've pulled in relevant operational and financial and performance data. You've pulled it all together. You've done some very clever data analysis, and you're tying it all together to identify trends and relationships between people's experience and the outcomes that matter most to your organization. And this is then going to get really interesting, because once you've got those relationships, once you can see those links, you can start forming hypotheses about what's going to drive improvement. So in that shop example, we just gave quite a simple set of metrics about happiness and engagement levels. But when you start digging deeper, you might discover that your top sales performers maybe feel more psychologically safe at work. It might be that they've all completed a particular sales training course in the last 12 months. It might be that they've been with the business for a particularly long period of time, maybe for 5 years or more. And from there, you can then start to form hypotheses. So it might be that if we increase psychological safety for those who currently feel unsafe, their sales performance will rise. Or if we ensure everyone completes the same sales training, we'll see an uplift in conversion rates for customers that walk through the doors. And once you form those hypotheses, the great thing is you've got the data to help you build a quantifiable business case. So if the data suggests, and it's going to cost £200,000 to roll out training across every single shop in a particular brand, maybe it's going to cost £200,000. But the data might suggest that's going to deliver an extra £750,000 in sales over the next 12 months. All of a sudden, you're not asking for budget, you're presenting an ROI forecast, and that's going to get the CFO to listen. It might also be, there's an example at the bottom of this table, it might also be that through your analysis, you can identify some initiatives. Maybe they've been sacred cows for the last X number of years and no one really knows how it started, but no one's ever got around to touching or changing them. The data might identify they're not effective. It might be that you can save money, scale back these activities enough to invest in other stuff that you've identified as maybe being more productive. And then with these hypotheses and forecasts, if you can, then try implementing them in a way that's going to give evidence about whether they're working or not. Do a split test. Obviously, not every initiative can be tested in a small, controlled way. So if your hypothesis was that people feeling fairly rewarded are going to perform better, you probably can't just increase the pay for one group of employees or, heaven forbid, decrease the pay for another group of employees. There was all sorts of issues with that at a legal level, at a scientific experiment level. But there are some that not only can, but probably you should be testing safely and incrementally. So I'll give you a real world example. Someone that I know, they were responsible for learning and development at a retailer that was a perfume retailer. And in his role, he'd developed a training program for their shop, their front of house staff, their shop employees. It was a really deep qualification. So at the end of it, if you completed it, you ended up with a diploma level qualification for their sales team. It was all about helping them to understand more about the perfumes, which scents were complementary, why it was a good idea not just to buy the perfume, but the matching soaps and the deodorants, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was just not practical to roll that new training course because it was so deep. You just couldn't do it company-wide in one fell swoop. So he had to test it with a small group of stores. But the nice thing is, with that approach, the results were really clear. It was no longer just theory, it was no longer just forecasts, but the stores that he rolled it out in, they saw an average increase of about £4 per transaction, which on an individual transaction, obviously that's not huge. But when you start multiplying that across, let's say 20 average transactions per day per store, 100 stores in the country, 360 something days trading per year, we had really solid evidence then that investing in this course, rolling this course out across all of the remaining stores in the organization, that could generate an additional £3 million in additional sales per year. And because it was tested in a controlled way, he had the hard evidence to take to the board, proof that it was working before investing in the full rollout. So, bit of a quick recap then on what we've covered. And by the way, look, this is exactly the framework. This is exactly how we do it for our customers. You start off, you identify the metrics that matter most to your organization and your leadership. You've captured feedback from your employees about how they think and feel at work. You've combined other data. You've combined data about their employees' performance, financial data, the outcomes. You tie this all together, you analyze it, you identify trends and relationships, and you use these insights, you use these relationships and links that you discovered to form hypotheses around what the impact will be of a future initiative. You use that to create your own forecasts and projections, and ideally, you've got a plan for how you can test these forecasts before committing to a full rollout. If you can get this right, if you can gather solid evidence that shows when you invest in a particular initiative, the expected outcome is positive, the data backs it up, it's brilliant news. It's just so wonderful for you and your organization. First of all, for the HR function, it means you can focus your limited time and resources on the initiatives that are going to make the greatest impact. It doesn't matter who you are. You could be working for Google, Meta, NVIDIA. Every organization has constraints. You can't possibly do everything you might want to do. This approach helps you to prioritize clearly which activities to double down on, which to experiment with, and which ones might be worth scaling back or stopping altogether. It also helps you protect your budgets. So I don't know about you, but certainly from where I'm standing, the economy is looking a little bit shaky at the moment. It's never been more important to prove the ROI of your work. So when you can demonstrate that your initiatives are driving measurable performance outcomes, those budgets are much harder to cut because you can show they're not just nice to haves, they're essential, they're drivers of growth. It might also be, the example I gave a moment ago, it might also be that you can fund new initiatives that the data supports by scaling back other stuff where the data shows it's not value for money. And third, perhaps most importantly, it absolutely ensures that HR is aligned with the strategic and commercial goals for the organization. So we've covered a lot. And if you're sat there thinking, thanks, David, this all sounds brilliant, but how am I ever going to do this? I just don't have the capacity to do it. I hear that a lot. You're not alone. And for many organizations, the hardest part isn't believing in the idea. It's just finding the time, the data, the capacity, the resource to put it all together and make it happen. That's ultimately exactly why we launched our performance consultancy at the Happiness Index. So it's designed to help you take the frameworks and ideas that we've spoken about today and apply them in your organization. It's all about turning insights about your culture into measurable impact for your organization. There is a second poll on the screen. So if you'd like to have a quick call with us to see if this approach can work for your organization, we've got this poll up. Just click yes, and we'll be in touch after the webinar. It's worth noting, because this is a brand new service, we do have a very special introductory offer. The consultancy, it's available on a simple month-by-month retainer. We're not going to tie you into a massive long-term commitment. If ever it's not adding value to you, you can walk away. If you start working with us now, because it's brand new, we are offering a pilot month absolutely free in return for a case study afterwards. So it will give you time to see the value for yourself and start uncovering insights that you can then use to influence your people strategy and crucially align it with your organization's goals. So thank you very much. If we just move on to the next slide. That's it. Like I said, we've covered a lot. Joe, who's been kind of working away in the background, making all these polls and things appear on the screen. Thank you for that. Joe, I don't know if any questions have come through yet. If not, I can talk a little bit about some that come up quite regularly. Just let me see the screen. How are you taking account of neurodiversity in your analysis? Yeah, really, really good question. So it really depends on the data that's pulled together. If we are capturing as part of the data that's being pulled together any neurodiversity amongst your employees, then we can factor that into the analysis. Who knows what that might, what intelligence that might show. It doesn't necessarily need to be neurodiversity data, but it might be that the organization has conducted things like DISC analysis amongst your employees as well. All of that, if you've got that data to hand, it can be pulled together. It's all useful for the insights that you might want to conduct. Joe, were there any others? Cool. I tell you, we've got a couple of minutes left, I think. So a few questions that I do get asked quite frequently is, how do we protect anonymity if we're looking at data at an individual level? Really good question. Something we get asked a lot, and we do take anonymity really, really seriously. So within our own platform, we have what we call our golden rule of 5. So we never break down the analysis to a group that's smaller than 5 people. When I'm talking about getting the data at an individual level, that can all get pulled together so you can identify trends based on individual performance without identifying who those individuals are. For a simple example, it might be that the average transaction value for a particular employee in a shop is whatever, £18. Well, we're not going to break it down by only show me people who've got an average transaction of £18. We might pull them together to say, right, how does the data compare for groups of employees that are generating between 18 and £20 per transaction versus people who are generating £30 per transaction? So we're protecting the anonymity, but we're still getting the performance data at a very granular level. See, another question's just popped up. One moment. I'd like to ask many questions, other targeted questions as well. Should I run this alongside as a separate survey? It's very difficult without seeing the number of questions that you might be trying to ask. Obviously, the questions need to be relevant to your organization. It just needs to be balanced with making sure that the survey, I suppose, is not too arduous for people to complete. You want to have it a nice balance so that you're getting useful insights to your organization without it causing most people not to bother completing the survey because it's going to take them an hour out of their day to do so. If you can ask them all in a single survey, that's preferable, but at the same time, like I said, it does need to be a balance. Worth pointing out as well, you don't need to take this approach. You don't need to be using our platform in order to take this approach. We do work with some organizations who use other employee engagement platforms for this type of approach. So I did complete a survey analysis using data from someone else who'd been using Peakon to collect their survey data. Obviously, we'd love you to use our platform, but it's not a prerequisite. Okay. Any others, Joe? Cool. All right. Well, look, with that, thank you so much for attending, everyone. I really do hope you found it interesting. I hope you found it thought-provoking. Hopefully, you've got some ideas about stuff you might start trying about your culture and tying it back to performance for your organization, particularly outside of the HR team. So thanks again. And I really do hope to continue this conversation with some of you soon. Thanks.